And I've just been told recording's in progress, so I will begin. And should I drop out or have any audio problems, perhaps somebody would flag that up. So thank you very much for coming along, everyone. And thank you to the Society for inviting me. My mum's side of the family is from Kirkcudbright, so it's very nice to be visiting, even if it is just virtually. My wife and I recently moved to Orkney, and so we're settling in very well, but it's nice to get a chance to think about Galloway again. I'll be talking sort of about the distribution of place names across the south of Scotland and what different areas look like in terms of a Gaelic perspective. But I thought you might be interested in an Orcadian perspective. And an Orcadian perspective is that above us there's Shetland, and below Orkney there's South. And that's it. It's from Caithness down to Land's End. That's all just South, and there's abroad. So, I'm going to be talking about some work I've been doing creating a database of Gaelic place names in the south of Scotland. And the main output of that is this map that you can see on my first slide, and that shows 4,138 Gaelic place names across the southern counties of Scotland. So that on the left side of your maps, Wigtonshire, Berwickshire, Dumfriesshire, and then into Roxburghshire and Berwickshire too. So this map basically shows the main message of that research, which is, first of all, there's a tremendous amount of Gaelic in the south of Scotland, but almost all of it is skewed over to the west of the region. Now, that east-west distribution might not be particularly surprising, but if you're unfamiliar with the Gaelic heritage of southwest Scotland, the sheer volume of place names might come as a bit of a surprise. And if you are interested in place name distribution, I think one of the maybe less expected things is the continuation of a Gaelic presence, not just in Galloway, but up into Upper Nithsdale and the whole Nith Valley. And then further, this sort of outcrop in the centre of your map in Eskdale, so in the east of Dumfriesshire. We seem to have a bit of a gap for the Solway Plain and the Annan Valley, but then we have an outcrop in Eskdale as well. And then we have this huge, great big drop-off, just a couple of names in Berwickshire and another handful in Roxburghshire. So should my Wi-Fi cut out, that is the main crux of the talk. The rest of it's going to be footnotes to that and talking about how we can make sense of that many points on a map and have a look at some distribution patterns across the region and within counties. Before I go on, I should say that this is work in progress, and the numbers will change when I go through this data again, and so some points will disappear from the map and some will be some extra points. Point distribution maps like this don't really deal with uncertainty very well. However, while it might not be 100% accurate, the picture's not going to change. There's a lot in the west, and there's hardly any in the east. So for the rest of the talk, I thought I'd speak a little bit about why I made this map, how I made it. It was all made using freely available information and software. So should you want to do something similar, you can do that. Incidentally, I didn't realize we were the original speaker was speaking about the railways. I've made lots of railway maps, and you can contact me later should you want to see some railway maps. And then I'll also talk about what we can learn from this map. But before doing that, I thought I'd talk just in some general terms about place names, why they're important, why they're interesting, and also some of the methodology behind studying place names. So hopefully my next slide should come along. There we go. So, place names are valuable for all sorts of reasons. They're inherently interesting. I think most people quite like the idea of finding out what their local name means. But we could sort of talk about why they're important under three headings. First of all, they record history that we wouldn't have access to otherwise. Also, they record experiences and perspectives of normal people, everyday people from a local area. And thirdly, a less historically focused reason is that they sort of give people a sense of belonging, a sense of place, and contribute to the what's sometimes called the intangible heritage of an area. So in terms of that first point, every place name, you can treat it like a micro story. So the place names describe something about the landscape at the time that name was coined, and it also records the language people were speaking. And down in the southwest, we're very lucky to have names in all of the major languages of the landscape in Scotland. So you have very, very early Brittonic, the language that people were speaking at the time the Romans came to the country. We also have Old English or Northumbrian, Old Norse, a later Brittonic, a Celtic language, sometimes called Cumbric, a cousin of Welsh. We've got Gaelic, we've got Scots, some laterally English names as well. That's very different to up here in Orkney, where basically we have Old Norse, we have Norn, its later development, and we have Scots and English. Whatever was going on here pre-Vikings has effectively been eclipsed. The Vikings just that came and renamed everything. So we've got very few records for this part of the country in the early medieval period. And the history of the people that spoke the languages here is essentially able to be reconstructed and understood by studying place names. And it's through place names that we're able to find out something of the history of the region. So just as an example of sort of the micro stories place names can tell, Kirkcudbright is a Gaelic name. It means Cuthbert's Church. So it's a Gaelic name commemorating a Northumbrian saint, and it's using a word Gaelic speakers adopted from Old Norse. So Kyrkja became Kirk. So you've got three linguistic sources bubbling around just in the name Kirkcudbright. And then along the road a wee bit, there's Borg. Borg's a name very familiar up here in Orkney. It's the Old Norse word for a fortress. And then running through Kirkcudbright, there's the River Dee, and that's recorded way back 2,000 years ago as Deva. And it's this Brittonic Celtic name meaning goddess. So we're able to record not just what people thought about the landscape around them, but we're able to reconstruct some of the interactions between the people and the languages that were here. Historical records where we do have them preserve the experience and the outlook of a privileged class of society, a very top society. We have kings and queens and people in power of that sort. And it's rare to hear from regular folk, from farmers and folk that are fishing and working the land in historical documents. And so place names give us a chance to listen to the outlook and perspective of folk that were walking the same bit of land that you're walking the now. And it's nice because you get to sometimes recognize what they saw in the landscape. And I think you can kind of split people's opinions of place names into those that realize that maybe a name like Garpal is from a Gaelic name, meaning rough stream, and then you can go to that stream, that burn, and you can see, oh, it really is rough, it's coming down over rocks. And some people find that fascinating, and some people are like, oh, that's okay. But it's nice to be able to hear from a class of people that we don't usually get to hear from. And finally, in terms of that third point, in terms of intangible heritage, whether you're interested actively in place names or not, the way they sound affects how you sort of your memories and your experience of a place. So up here in Orkney, as I was saying, place names sound very, very different to down in the southwest of Scotland. And you can notice this in the southwest, just travelling between counties as you move from the Rhins through to we're on the border of Dumfriesshire, and then from Dumfriesshire across to Langham. The names and the landscape sound different, and they look different too. And as a wee example, here on the left, they're talking of Fad and Troston in New Abbey, and then so which are Gaelic names. And then moving east, we get more Old Norse names, Fishbeck, Dryfoam and Lockerbie, all Old Norse names. So that's a little bit about why place names are useful and important and interesting in general. And I thought I'd just tell you a little bit about why and how they're studied. So it's really, really important when looking at place names to try and find the earliest possible records, because over time, place names change their form, which can hide their original meaning. Generally, as a name becomes obscure, as languages change, people reanalyze a name to make it make a bit more sense to them. And the record can become very, very garbled very, very quickly. So it's important to use early forms where they're available. And as an example, we've got 3 Kirk names here, and you might want to have a guess just now at which of these refers to a church and which of those don't refer to a church. So we've got Stony Kirk in Wigtonshire, which looks like a church made of stone, but we've got a very early record from 1275 records the place as Stan Acra. That shows that it's actually an Old English name, referring to a stony field rather than a stony church. Westerkirk over in Dumfriesshire looks transparently like a church in the west, but again, a 13th century record, Wadsterker, shows that it's made of this Old Norse word wad for a ford and a personal name. And the only one that really does refer to a church is Bridekirk, which in the 16th century was actually recorded as Bride Chapel, just before being changed to Bridekirk. Another really important thing that we need to use as much as possible is local sources, local information in terms of pronunciation and in terms of local tradition. And a quite often used example is this place name that looks like Muirdroch Wood in Carstfern, and I would say this as Muirdroch Wood were I reading it off of a map, but the local pronunciation is something like Murdrochit, and combined with early records, we can use that to inform us that really this is a Gaelic name, Mark Drochid, Markland of the Bridge. Tradition is really important too. There's a great name called Dragon's Well in Hutton and Corrie. And Johnson Ferguson in his place names of Dumfriesshire thought, well, that's probably going to be a name for a marsh marigold. Fair enough. However, we do have an entry in the Burn and Hervey name books. So when the first edition of the urban survey map was being made, the surveyors wrote down as much information as they could about places. And this local tradition was recorded that Dragon's Well really does refer to a dragon. It was very exciting, especially when you spend your time looking at lots and lots of quite prosaic names like Burnside and Big Hill and things like that. It's nice to come across something like this. So place names are important for the reasons I mentioned, but they're not transparent sources. You need to use as much information as you can. Now, it's a bit like doing close reading. The approach I've taken is a bit more like distant reading. I've not had time to look at early sources in detail. I've used them as much as I can, but quite often I've had to rely on intuition. So that's an element of uncertainty that's already introduced into this database. So, I thought I'd talk now about this map, why I made it, how I made it, and what we can learn. So there's sort of 2 motivations for me having a look at this data set. And the first is that the Gaelic heritage of Galloway is sort of hidden in plain sight. As you can see from the map, there's a tremendous amount of Gaelic presence in Galloway in particular, but people on the whole generally aren't aware of it, or at least not as aware of the scale of Gaelic's influence in the southwest. And that's not for any particular reason. I think some people, there's occasionally political and ideological reasons for perhaps downplaying Gaelic's presence in a region, but in the most part, there's quite good and understandable reasons why people aren't aware of it. So occasionally I'll have people say things like, well, I'm not sure why there's a Gaelic form on the sign at Dumfries Station, without realising that Dumfries is a Gaelic name, means something like Fort of the Thicket, or saying things like, well, there's maybe a bit of Gaelic in the Rhins, but nobody spoke it in Dalbeattie, without realising that Dalbeattie itself is a Gaelic place name, means something like Ground Haw, or water meadow prone to flooding, something like that. So I'll maybe just get back to that map. This is quite a good way of just being able to counter questions and doubts like that. And it's a picture telling 1,000 words, and you can look at this and go, oh, there's a tremendous amount of Gaelic. And eventually this database will become a web map, and you'll have the opportunity to go on and find where you are and look at the Gaelic names around you, if you want to. But it's worth maybe pausing to think, if there's such a great big Gaelic presence in the southwest, why is it that people are unaware of it? And I think the most there's maybe two main reasons. One is that Gaelic stopped being a community language for before people had experience of it and before it really made the modern historical record. So the last speaker of Southwest Gaelic died incredibly late in 1760. That was Margaret McMurray. But by that time, she was in a very small number of people that are still speaking Gaelic in the region. Gaelic stopped being a community language a good 100 years before that for a lot of people, and really by 1500 Scots was taking over as the major community language. And because of that, because we've not had a continuous use of Gaelic as a community language, when our place names were written down, they were written down phonetically. So rather than being written, like you can see on the sign, for Dumfries, as a two-word Gaelic phrase, it's just written roughly as it sounds and how it's pronounced by local people. Were our place names written out in their standard Gaelic spelling, it would be much, much more obvious to people about the heritage of that language in this area. And that's fair enough. And while I think it's a really useful sort of output of this project to be able to say, oh, look, there's a lot of Gaelic here, that wasn't really the main motivation I had for making this database. It's sort of beyond the scope of this talk to talk about the history of Gaelic in Galloway. However, should you be interested, I can thoroughly recommend this excellent book, Galloway, the Lost Province of Gaelic Scotland, which will tell you in tremendous detail about the history of language in this area. The thing that really piqued my interest and sort of encouraged me to take on this project was I was looking at the Berwickshire Place Names project, which came out of the University of Glasgow, and they recorded 6 Gaelic place names in the whole county. And there's more than that just at the tip of the Mull of Galloway. I've got Carrick Carlin there, and then Shalloth and Craignahary and Lagbag, and a few more there as well. And I was just really interested to see how we could go from one end of the country having 6 place names, just a handful, to going out to the Rhins where you chuck a stone and you hit a Gaelic place name. And while there's been studies of Dumfriesshire and Galloway in terms of their place names, and we know there's a lot of place names from Gaelic in those counties, I don't think it's clear just how many there were. And I was interested to see if we have like a linear decline. Did things peter through Roxburghshire and then sort of really tail off in Berwickshire? So that was the main motivation for making this map. So I thought I'd talk a little bit just about how you go about creating a database of over 4,000 names. And should you want to do something similar, this might give you insight on how you could start doing that. So we've been very lucky in that all the names, in fact, all the text and all other entries on the 2nd edition of the Ordnance Survey 6-inch map have been transcribed for Scotland, England, and Wales. That was part of a project that was published as the GB 1900 Gazetteer. I had a quick look. Again, this site seems to have gone offline for a while, so should you want this data, you can email me for it. Hopefully that will come back online again. And so what I did was I went parish by parish. In fact, had to slightly recalibrate the parishes because for some reasons you don't need to bother yourself with just now, but the parishes on that database were slightly skew with. But basically, once I recalibrated those parishes, I went through each parish and marked down whatever I thought looked even vaguely like a Gaelic name. So as you can see, there's about 5,500 entries in Wigtonshire, about 9,000 in Berwickshire, huge amount in Dumfriesshire, and adding up all those southern counties, you get about 37,000 entries. So I just went through all of those parish by parish and marked off anything that looked Gaelic. Alarmingly, that's about a sixth of Scotland. I calculated that the other day, so I've read a fair few place names. Once I did that, I loaded information into a map making software called QGIS, which you can download. It's free, and you can make all sorts of cool things with it. All it costs is your time. And so parish by parish, I put all the names in. And so this is Sanker, and that background map's from the National Library of Scotland, showing the first edition OS. I then filtered out anything I thought looked Gaelic. And then I went place by place, taking away derived names. So, for example, there's Glendyne and there's Glendyne Burn there, so I'd get rid of Glendyne. Once I'd got that down, if I had available sources, I went through just to double check that I wasn't being led astray. Overall, I've been fairly cautious. I didn't want to overstate the amount of place names that we had. So when I wasn't sure, I didn't include a name. So I think were I to take a second pass at this, the numbers would increase slightly. That kind of changes where you are in the region. So if you're out in the Rhins, if something looks Gaelic, it almost certainly is Gaelic. If you're in Berwickshire, it probably isn't Gaelic. So it's a wee example of the filtering process. So this is Larbrax and Liswell. And so we don't actually have the name Larbrax on the map. We've got Little and Moor and Lodge and Cottages and Meikle and Bay. And so I only kept one of these, and that's the same for every other name which has duplicates. In some cases, you can go back and look. This is a map from 1740s, and you can actually say that we've got Largbrex there. In quite a lot of cases, the Gaelic name is enclosed in a later Scots name. So you might get like Meikle Knockbrex or East Knockbrex, not Knockbrex, the Gaelic name itself. So it's maybe worth saying that really this is recording derived names. That's a technicality that's it's worth bearing in mind. So obviously Knockbrex existed at some point as a Gaelic name, but it may not exist now as a clear Gaelic name. It's embedded in somewhere else. So once I'd done that, I would then have a look at the first edition OS, because these names come from the second edition. And quite often by that time, we farmsteads have disappeared. And so on the left-hand side, you can see the first edition down in Kirkmaiden, and there's a place called Craigenbarach. But that name wasn't on the original database that I used. If you have a look on the right-hand side of your screen, there's a big blank where Craigenbarach was. So as well as going through all these names in a database, I've also looked visually. So there were probably some names missing, but I don't think many. I've been pretty fastidious, just scrolling backwards and forwards over the OS. On the right-hand side, you can also see all the other information that ended up on that database, which you can download. So it's not just place names, but you can see there's old quarries, old gravel pits, Celt found twice. So all that stuff has to be filtered out clearly at names. So overall, once all that process was done, These are the number of place names that I ended up with. So in Wigtonshire, a little bit over 1,700. In Kirkcudbrightshire, 1,700 exactly. And then a great big drop off once we get to Dumfriesshire, just under 700. And then Roxburghshire and Berwickshire, just a couple of names between them. It's worth bearing in mind that these counties aren't the same size. Wigtonshire is about half the size of Dumfriesshire, despite having more than twice the number of names. So in the right-hand column there, you can see the number of Gaelic place names per square mile. And so Wigtonshire has a tremendous amount, especially compared to Roxburghshire and Wigtonshire. So that's one way of getting an impression of just how much or how many Gaelic place names there are per county. That's one way of looking at it. And that's quite a good indication if you have a look over at the left of the map that Wigtonshire really is quite wee. Loose Bay takes out a great big chunk, and Loch Ryan at the top there takes out a chunk as well. So what I want to talk about now is maybe just how we can make sense of all those points on the map. The general picture is clear, but there's no way you can process 4,000 points by looking at it. There's lots of patterns hidden in here that we can explore using various ways. Just before that, though, it's maybe worth thinking about how accurate this map is, and is there a way of judging how accurate this is? This is mostly just how I've interpreted the data. I've relied on other sources where possible, but there's not been recent and comprehensive studies of the place names of, well, really of most of Scotland, and even less so down in the south. However, recently, the Galloway Glens project had a place name study, which you can access at the URL down at the bottom of the slide there. And that's looked at all the place names, or almost all the place names in the parishes of the Galloway Glens. And so that does give us a chance to compare my results with something done as a professional academic study, a funded project, not just me doing it in the evenings. So it's a good chance to see how likely my data is to be secure. So on the left-hand side, you've got the number of place names per parish in the Galloway Glens, and my total is 615. The Galloway Glens database is a little bit less than that, it's 590, and you might have expected there to be the Galloway Glens database to have more than me because they used older sources. I've only used the Ordnance Survey, and there's lots and lots of place names that are now obsolete. However, there's some reasons why I don't think that discrepancy is quite as large as it seems. Take Crossmichael as an example. I've got 41 names, and the Galloway Glens database has 37. However, for existing names that we EN tag there, the database, the Galloway Glens database, doesn't always treat the embedded names. So for Carlochan Hill and Cultam Hill, these aren't treated as Gaelic names, they're just treated as Scots names that are using a previous name, but they don't specify the language for that. I also have another Dunjarg, which wasn't included in the Galloway Glens database, and also Lingdarren. So that takes us up to roughly about the same now. Both got 41 names. I didn't consider Roan Park to be a Gaelic place name. They do. I thought Ringenway was a Gaelic place name. They don't. So although there's some differences there, we roughly get the same. And I think that's probably replicated across the rest of the parishes too. However, if I am out by about 25, that's a 4% difference, which isn't nothing, but it's pretty small, and I think it wouldn't change the complete nature of the distribution map. I'd be out over the course of 4,000 names by about 168. Like I say, I think we're probably closer than that. I think I'll be off by something. There will be some false positives, but I don't think too many. Okay, and with that out of the way, I thought we could now just have a look at ways of visualizing this data and how we can maybe make sense of some distribution patterns. So the first thing you can do, try and make sense of 4,000 points, is to just split them into groups. And this is an east-west distribution. So the pink on the left has about 2,000 names, and the blue on the right has got about 2,000 names. And that lets you see that we've got this great big skew towards Wigtonshire and Eastern Kirkcudbrightshire. You can do that for as many bands as you like. We could split it into groups of 4 here, so each with about 1,000. And that's quite a good way of showing that the Rhins and about half of Wigtonshire account for the same number of names as all of Dumfriesshire almost, Wigtonshire, Berwickshire, and a bit of Kirkcudbrightshire. So it's a way of showing that we have a really strong skew towards Wigtonshire, even within Galloway. The further west you go, the denser the names. A problem with doing that, though, is you don't really get to see patterns within those bands. So a way around that is to use heat maps, and this shows the density of place names by the intensity of colour. So the lighter the colour, the denser the distribution of names. And so this flags up that the Rhins is very, very dense with Gaelic names. We also get to see central Kirkcudbrightshire, and the spot in the middle there is around Balmaclellan, and sort of coming sweeping down towards Suffolk too. And you can see the big bright bands in the Wigtonshire moors and the Machars too. And the thing I'm particularly interested in is that we get this not as dense, but still considerable distribution in northern Dumfriesshire, up in Upper Nithsdale too. Roxburghshire and Berwickshire just don't show up on this at all. We're just not dense enough. So that's very pretty. I think it's really cool. I think it tells a useful story. The problem with heat mapping is that you've got no real indication of numbers. You get an indication of how strong or how weak a distribution is, but you can't talk about it in absolute terms. A way around that is by splitting your map into a grid. And so here I've split the map into the 5K squares, so taking Ordnance Survey grid squares and mapping the distribution of Gaelic names there. And so we go from 85 per box at the very top down to 1. And that's a sort of a finer grained way of looking at that. And that's quite useful. You can still see that Balmaclellan in the centre there is very bright. And you can see down at the bottom in Kirkmaiden that very bright too. The problem for this is that humans are pretty bad at reading colour scales. So another way around that is to then just sort of take a minesweeper approach and pop that data in. So I think if we're looking at a flat distribution map, that's maybe the clearest way of getting an absolute picture. So you can see down at the bottom in Kirkmaiden, there's about 85 names in that little 5K square. There's 50 around Balmaclellan, and then if you look up in Upper Nithsdale, there's 22 around Mennick and Sanquhar. So that's a way of approaching the data in absolute terms. Another way around this, though, is to not display your data in terms of a flat map. It's quite useful to be able to project this information as a 3D image. And so what you're able to do is you can take a map like this and grayscale it, and then you can take that into some path tracing software and generate 3D maps. And this is used using a process, a product called Aerialod. It's free as well. You can just download this, and it means you get to produce a map like this. So this takes a little bit of getting your head around. So I'll leave this up for a wee bit. On the left-hand side, you've got the Rhins, and you might be able to sort of imagine Luceby at the bottom there in Loch Ryan is where you get this little isthmus in between the two. The great big spike in the centre is around Balmaclellan, and then moving over to Berwickshire in the east. So obviously this is gives you an impression. It's not very easy to get direct data from, but I do think it's a good way of being able to visualize just how many place names we have out in the west and how few out in the east. The next slide shows the perspective if you're sort of out in the North Sea looking towards Berwickshire with Galloway in the background. So you can see this great big series of pillars rearing up as you look towards Galloway. And then this is looking south. This time the Rhins are on the right-hand side of your screen. You've got Kirkholm at the top, and then Kirkmaiden is the spike behind. So not a visualization you can get clear numbers from, but I think a useful way of being able to look at the volume that we have in the region. So, in terms of some clearer data, some points back on a flat map again, I thought I'd quickly look at some counties and see what sort of information we have, because this is meant to give you an overview of the distribution of Gaelic place names south. So I thought I'd have a look at some of these parishes individually. So these are the 6 place names that the Berwickshire Place Name Project identified in Berwickshire. William J. Watson, who wrote the History of Celtic Place Names in Scotland in the 1920s, said he thought there'd be about 29 Gaelic place names in Berwickshire, using the OS map and some older sources too. I think that's almost certainly too many. A few of his suggestions have been shown not to be viable Gaelic options. I think he might be right about some of them that haven't been included in the Berwickshire project, but even if he was completely right, if there's 29 names, it's still a drop in the ocean compared to Galloway. And the point about these names is that quite a lot of them are on a shugly peg. Duns, for example, that could be a Brittonic name. It could be an Old English name too. Same for Ross. It could be Gaelic, quite as likely to be a Brittonic name as well. So there's a chance, I mean, if William Watson was completely right, we might have almost 30. We might end up with only 4. There's a very, very low number of place names out in Berwickshire. If I didn't have access to the Berwickshire place name data, I would have almost certainly included Auchenkraw in my survey. That looks like a Gaelic place name. But you can see on the right-hand side, these were the forms all the way back from the 1200s up to 1860. It's quite a good example of the sort of the huge amount of research that goes into assessing place name data. So this project's been able to recover about 19 sources which show conclusively this isn't an Auchen, a field of the Gaelic place name. It's an Old English name, probably means old grave or old grove or something like that. Roxburghshire, I make it 13. But there's some of these I'm not that confident about at all. William J. Watson, he thought there were 16. I'm not sure which ones he had. I've missed, I imagine they're documentary ones. And there's a few that he suggests that are, again, maybe on a bit of a shugly peg. I'm not at all confident about Inchbonny. Not sure about Dunyan Hill either. Annet Hill down the bottom, that'd be a really interesting Gaelic name. Feels almost too interesting to be there, but it'd be great if it was. And Knock Hills. I mean, Knock is a Gaelic word for a wee hill, but it gets adopted into Scots. There's quite a reasonable chance that this is just a Scots farm called Knock, and Knock Hills are the hills named after the farm. I included it though because I wasn't completely sure. So Roxburghshire 13 just now in my survey. I imagine that'll go down. And should anyone know that I'm definitely wrong about some of these. It'd be excellent just to know. You can email me or tell me in the chat box, and I'll excise them from the record. Here's an example of something misleading. So I spotted Glen. I don't know how you pronounce this. I'd say Glengerrig if it is in Gaelic. So this looks like a Gaelic place name meaning Red Glen. But the Ordnance Survey name book records that this is a recent house, and the name Glengerrig had no existence in the locality before Walter Scott wrote about it. And the original name of the place is Calf Hill. So a good example of why you need to rely on sources and not just how names look. However, once we cross the border from Roxburghshire into Dumfriesshire, the picture completely changes, and we get up to about 670 names. And as you can see, there's a really strong presence in the west of the region. On the right-hand side, I've got the Nith, the Annan, and the Esk marked in. My wife asked me if I'd drawn these in using Microsoft Paint. These are the OS's data files for the rivers. I'll have to get better at rendering them if they look like they've been done in Paint. But as you can see, the Nith doesn't form a barrier to Gaelic and Dumfriesshire. On the east side of it, we've still got a fairly strong presence, especially up in Durrisdeer and Kirkconnell and Sanquhar. There's a wee cluster around the head of the Esk, and I'll talk about that a bit later. But once you're east of the Annan, things do begin to peter off a little bit. If you're wondering if your parish makes the top 20 place names, or top 20 for number of Gaelic place names, here they are. I've just popped it up to show that Sanquhar, Dumfriesshire parish, is pretty high up in terms of its representation of Gaelic place names. Obviously, I take these numbers with a bit of a pinch of salt because you get some tiny parishes and you get some massive parishes, and you get some that are depopulated, so that have many names, and you get some wee ones that are really dense. But on the whole, you can see that Sanquhar, a Dumfriesshire parish, features pretty highly. Minigaff's a huge parish, so it's obviously going to have lots and lots. Kirkmaiden's pretty wee, considering, but it comes in at second by a huge number of Gaelic place names. Okay, so I thought for the final part of this talk, I'd mention a little about the role geography and topography plays in the distribution. Out west, there's lots and lots of Gaelic. There's a persistence of Gaelic that has carried on for a long time. The geography doesn't play into a huge amount. But I thought where Gaelic begins to peter out, there might be some topographic reasons for why it's stuck around, or why its place names stuck around. I don't think the river valleys gave a particularly clear picture. You could maybe try and make some pattern out of that. Annandale does feel like once you cross that, you're getting a bit less, but then you get this rump left over in Eskdale. So I don't think a 2D distribution is particularly helpful. I think it's maybe a bit clearer when you look at the topography of the region. So this is a 3D map I made of an old OS map of southwest Scotland. And I'll give you a little bit of time just to get your eye into that. But you can see up the Nith Valley into Dumfries, into Upper Nithsdale, get these really big, deep glens. And I thought it might be interesting to see how our distribution pattern maps onto this geography. So I'm not sure how well this will show up on the hall. I'm not sure how well it will show up on your screens, but here are some, here's our distribution map. So hopefully what you can see is that out in Eskdale, so that's right at the very east of this map, the place names cluster around these deep river valleys and these deep glens. I've not had a look yet at Crawford in Lanarkshire, but that is, if you can make out sort of like a little V shape in our distribution pattern towards north of the map, That V shape where it's blank and they've got those deep glens is Crawford and Lanarkshire. And it'd be really interesting to know if our Gaelic place names persist into there or if they begin to peter off like they do towards the right of the map. Then it might be a wee bit clearer, zoomed in. We've lost Roxburgh and Berwickshire for now. But hopefully you can see towards the top of the map this cluster of names in Upper Nithsdale is associated with sort of quite rugged, deeply cut topography, and you get the same pattern down in Eskdale. You don't really seem to get the same up at the top of the Annan Valley, and hopefully I'm going to continue this this project into Berwickshire and Lanarkshire. I'm probably going to have a wee break from it for a while. I'll have a think about Carrick, but eventually I should hopefully get most of southern Scotland done. It'll be really interesting to see how these deep valleys and this rugged terrain in the southern uplands, if that supports Gaelic place names or if the cutoff really is Nithsdale. It'll be interesting to see. Okay, so just for the last 5 minutes before I wrap up, I thought I'd have a look at some distribution patterns within the names. So we've talked lots and lots about geography, lots in the west, no much in the east. But if we have a look at Dumfriesshire, Berwickshire, and Wigtonshire, I thought it might be interesting to see if we can spot some patterns in the data. So what I've done is I've taken wildcard searches for how Gaelic place names come out in Scots. So I've not yet classified the data by its Gaelic form, but Auchen is how the Gaelic phrase Ach in the field of the comes out in Scots. And so I thought it'd be interesting just to see if you can spot some patterns. So I've done these in point maps and heat maps. Because these are wildcards, there's a chance of the odd false positive, like a Clochan name or something might turn up. You're not going to get too much false positives in this, though. So this was a wee bit of a surprise. Auchen feels like a very typical type of Gaelic place name, and I would expect to see the concentration west, but instead we get this up the Nith Valley, central Dumfriesshire, down in southern Kirkcudbrightshire too. So that was a wee bit of a surprise. I'm not quite sure why we've got that, but there's 92 place names like this. The dense concentration seems to be in Dumfriesshire. Bar, sometimes spelt with 1 R, sometimes spelt with 2 R's. Crops up in Bar Head, it's a really, really common name in the southwest. There's about 262 bar names, and these are clustered in Wigtonshire and Kirkcudbrightshire. Doesn't form a large part of the naming pattern of Dumfriesshire. Drum, which represents Gaelic Thrime, just a ridge, has an awful lot too. About 291 of this form. It'll come as no surprise if you've been to Wigtonshire, which is a very Droimy region, very up and down, egg basket, drumlin, post-glacial landscape. We get lots of drums in Wigtonshire and around Ballymaclellan too. Again, a bit of a difference in Dumfriesshire, Upper Nithsdale, not really seeing that much. However, in Dumfriesshire, we do see glen a lot, and part of the pattern of these topographical names is that they reflect the landscape that they're coined in. So Wigtonshire very drummy, Upper Nithsdale very glenny, and you can see we get most of these up in where's that in Driftier, Kirkconnell, Sanctuary area, and this bit out east in Eskdale too. Knock, the word for a wee hill, although sometimes quite big hills. Knockendach on Criffel is pretty high. These are clustered really, really densely out in the Rhins. But I'm not sure if I can see the Roxburgh one if my camera's covering it, but that one Knock name out in Roxburghshire looks on even more of a sugary peg considering the western distribution of these names. Before I go into the next one, this is a map, and apologies, I'm not sure how well this will come out on screen. There's about 20,000 names. So in blue, it's all the names on the second edition West that contain Burn, and in red, all those that contain Alt, with strict spelling as well. So the ones that begin ALLT are red, and the ones that end in BURN are blue. And this traces out basically a Lowland Scots area and a Gaelic area. So Alt, the standard Gaelic word for a burn. As you'll see, we don't get any in the south. There's two reasons for that. One is that we don't spell things in standard Gaelic spelling, so we do get a wee smattering of alt names, and ALT sometimes reanalyzed as AL, so AULD, sometimes just AL. But the real reason that we don't get many of these is that that word just wasn't used very much in the southwest. The typical burn name down in southern Scotland is Paul, which usually is a pool in Highland Gaelic. And the really interesting thing about this is that we get a clear continuity of usage from Upper Nithsdale, top of Kirkcudbrightshire, and the top of Wigtonshire too. And while some of the other distribution patterns seem to show a bit of a Galloway Dumfriesshire split, I think this is really important for showing that we've got a continuity of naming patterns, right from Durrisdeer through to New Luce, places like that. So the heat map looks like this, and I believe in Newcomnock, which is just up past Fanter, you get something similar, and I imagine it's going to trace round on the Carrick side too. And that is almost my time. I've got 2 slides to go. The first is this. This is a wee map that shows the distance from the wee white dot in the middle, which is Stranraer, and it traces a circle 90 kilometres distant from Stranraer. And as you can see, before it hits Dumfries, we take in the Isle of Man, the north of Ireland, the island of Rathlin, Kintyre, almost all of Arran. And I think this is a useful way to think about part of the Gaelic presence in the southwest of Scotland, is that we're used to thinking of north as up. In this case, it probably makes sense to have west as up. And it's a useful way of thinking about southwest Scotland and southeast Scotland in the context of other Gaelic-speaking areas. So the Isle of Man, Ireland, and Kintyre, and even the Hebrides too. Gaelic arrived in Galloway, and not the always easiest to understand terms, but essentially we're spreading through Carrick, and we're probably getting reinforcement from Ireland. So it's entirely understandable that we have this concentration out in the Rhins. But when you look at it like this, Nithsdale, Upper Nithsdale, is still a long way from there. It's a long way from Isle of Man. Feels like a long way inland from Kintyre, from Ireland. And I think that's a useful way to think about it, that we have this persistence of Gaelic. It's not just because it's close to other Gaelic-speaking areas. It's because Nithsdale, Kirkcudbrightshire, Wigtonshire, were a heartland of Gaelic-speaking people for a long time. And although it's not immediately clear now, hopefully this sort of map, sort of database, makes clear that there's a very strong Gaelic heritage deep inland into southern Scotland. And I think I'll call it time there. Thank you very much.